the morning star of the Reformation. He attempted to bring this truth, this spiritual reform, through Martin Luther and all the other reformers that we read about. So then we go to the church at Sardis. We're going to have to hurry. I think we will skip with reading the church at Sardis text. This is the ruins of Sardis, and that mountain back there is Mount Tmolus. It's 6,700 feet tall. At the top of this mountain, there was a city built. Cyrus, the same man we read about earlier, in 549 conquered this city that had assumed itself to be unconquerable because it was built on the top of this mountain. And there was only one way in, and they guarded that one way. Well, Cyrus watched the place, and he realized that there was a place on this mountain that nobody paid any attention to. And he sent his men scaling up the side of that mountain. So his army went in at this one point that was not guarded, and they conquered. So rather than being vigilant and paying attention, they sat on their heels and thought themselves secure. We must always be vigilant for the truth of God. Whenever we think we're secure, we may fall. John Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation. And like I said on that chart that I have, I start Sardis not in 1798, but in 1350, because that's when Wycliffe began to do his work. He was the first one to publish the Bible in English from the Latin, and he thought that the Bible should be distributed among anybody who could read. The people who worked with him were called lollards, and they went out among the countryside. If people couldn't read, they distributed Bibles to them and taught them how to read, and left Bibles with them. Rick?
And also about that same time period on continental Europe, you had the Waldensians distributing Bibles in the French tongue and in the German tongue.
That's right.
And Martin Luther, just a couple of hundred years later, published the first printed Bible in the vernacular.
That's right. That's right. So putting the Bible back into the hands of the average person was one of the major things that the Reformation did, because under the Church of Thyatira, not only was education kept from the common man, but the Bible was locked up. It was not translated into a language that anybody spoke, and even if it was not distributed. It was kept chained in a church, and you were not allowed to read it. It had to be interpreted for you by the priest. So one of the major things that the work of the Reformation did was to put the Bible back in the common man's hands. The Sardian period was an age of separation and return to the rule of Christ, the age of comparative freedom from Balaam and his doctrines, and from the Nicolaitans and their tenets, and from Jezebel and her fornications. It was an age of many worthy names, but marked with deadness just the same, and having much of which to repent, an age covering the spiritual lethargy of Protestant countries before the great evangelical movements of the last 100 years. Now this is this book that was written in 1901, so the last 100 years that he's referring to is the 100 years of, this is 1901, so it would start 1800s. So what he's speaking of here is that great Reformation period of the Great Awakening, and we'll study that when we get to the next church. The Protestant Reformation in the letter to Sardis promises inauguration, development, corruption, and Protestant Reformation. So we see this, that the Protestant Reformation began, but it didn't go as far as it should have done. It lived off the deeds and accomplishments of the people who started the Reformation. The Lutherans stopped. They did not go on and carry the doctrine of the Church of God back as far as it should go. The Calvinists carried it a little bit further, but they stopped. The second generation didn't go on with the work and do what they were supposed to do. So they claimed to be alive for Christ. They claimed to have returned and to have escaped papalism, but they were still dead because they didn't carry the Reformation as far as it should go. And so it has come about. Now this is a more modern term, but it applied to Sardis, and it applies to us today, this quote. This is from James Anthony Froude. He died in 1894, and he was speaking of the times, his time, when he wrote this. And he was addressing the ecumenism that was taking place in his day. Well, it's perfectly applicable to our day as well. What he's addressing here as the common foe is an alarming rise of infidelity, adultery, drunkenness. So that's what Freud is addressing in this statement. But it applies today too. It applied back then in Sardis because the compromise took place even then. They decided that rather than persecution, we would just kind of say, well, all right, maybe we've come far enough in our getting away from papalism. So Freud says, and so it has come about that the old enemies are becoming friends in the presence of a common foe. Catholics speak tenderly of Protestants as keeping alive the belief in the creeds, and they look forward to their return to the sheepfold. While the old Antichrist, the scarlet woman on the 7 hills, drunk with the blood of the saints, is now treated by Protestantism as an old sister and a valiant ally in the great war against infidelity. The points of difference are forgotten. The points of union are passionately dwelt upon. The dread of popery is gone. As we see Christian churches today, and there are many, many of them, who are willing to reach the hands across the gulf. You remember a document back in 1994, Catholics and Evangelicals together, or Evangelicals and Catholics together, ECT. They reached the hand across the gulf because they had a common enemy. They said, we've got to deal with this enemy of abortion. We've got to deal with this enemy of homosexuality. And they're willing to unite with whoever will help them fight this common enemy. They don't realize they're walking right back into Rome's hands. And Rome is welcoming them. The church at Philadelphia. Dare we charge on? The first Great Awakening, the history of the Church of Philadelphia was very exciting. There were a lot of things that took place during this church period. The first Great Awakening occurred during the years 1730 to 1770. The work of John Wesley, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and others, the Protestant Reformation, had new life breathed back into it. These guys said, no, we must understand that righteous living is a necessity. We've got to get back to the things of God. And they began to preach great revivals, both in Britain and in America. These were American colonies, remember. In this country, the work of Charles Finney, Lyman Beecher, Alexander Campbell, and others in America were developing exceptional concepts of the soon coming of Christ. They got back in the Bible and began to study the Scriptures, and they determined from reading the Scriptures that Christ was coming soon. At these, they held Bible conferences all around the country and all around Europe, particularly England. And they could see the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation. They understood the 2300 days. They understood the 1260 days. They applied that to the papacy. They knew who the papacy was. And these were Bible conferences that were held by Baptists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians. Alexander Campbell was the founder of the Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ. These churches all had a concept and an understanding of who that Antichrist was. They knew, because they hadn't had futurism introduced to them yet. That came in 1830. Remember, we studied that in that first lesson. During this time period, missionary efforts expanded around the globe. 1793, William Carey went to India. 1797, the first missionaries to Tahiti in the South Seas. 1804, the first Bible Society was formed in England. 1807, Robert Morrison went to China. I mean, there was this explosion of ecumenical work, not ecumenical, evangelistic work, where it was decided that, yes, Christ is coming soon. I mean, we must warn the people that this is happening, and people must understand the Bible. The Bible was translated into many, many languages at this time. There was a great work that was taking place. In this country, during the 1830s and 40s, under the preaching of William Miller and the searching of the prophecies and scriptures took place. And there was a great revival in this country under the work of William Miller and others. He wasn't the only one. But they came to understand that the prophecies, the 2300-day prophecy, was going to come to an end. They missed the date, and they missed the true fulfillment of that prophecy, and it was a great disappointment. With this great disappointment, many people decided that it really wasn't worth the effort, and they fell into the Laodicean state.